are live now.
All right.
Let's see how many people are here. Okay, the people are joining. That's good. Let's see. So we'll wait a bit. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. I think we can wait like some 2-3 minutes and then start. Ryan is already with us, so
Hey, everyone.
I'll go a bit later and introduce them. So we can wait about, I think, 1 more minute because people are just connecting and then start. Meanwhile, yeah. Okay, great. Okay, I think we can start. So, hello everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today for CyHub Armenia webinar series. And we are super happy to host our first one. We are with a very special guest joining us from the United States, Ryan Kazanciyan, who is also a fellow Armenian, of course. And he is a security engineer, advisor, and was famous also being technical advisor to Mr. Robert TV series. But I'll just pass to you, Ryan, to introduce you a bit and give you more background. And then we can start our conversation about different topics today, from career to Infosec, how to start a startup into cybersecurity, and also definitely talking about your experience while working on Mr. Robert TV series. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you for joining us. So please go ahead.
Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be invited and have the opportunity to speak to you all. So yeah, thank you very much for joining me this morning here in the US, or this afternoon or early evening, I guess, for you all. A little about myself before we get started. So I live in the Washington, D.C. area in a city called Alexandria, which is just across the river from D.C. I live with my wife, a 15-month-old baby boy, Ezra, and we have a little Boston Terrier dog that also keeps life interesting and exciting. So I've got all the doors closed and everything strategically arranged, so hopefully no one rushes in. It can be a little chaotic. Let's see. I've been in the security field for gosh, almost 20 years, which makes me feel old, but it is what it is. And in a number of different roles. When I was in college, I had an early interest in hacking. This was the days of like where bulletin board systems were just moving into like online ISPs, and I was finding and reading everything I could about hacking, phone phreaking, and was just fascinated by it. So I went to college knowing I really wanted to learn about security. And at the time, there was no focus in security. There was no undergraduate programs. So I took a path in computer science, but in parallel to that, continued to learn as much as I could about hacking in different domains in network security. And I knew coming out of it that I didn't want to go into the traditional software development path. And so that kind of led me to go into industry in what at the time was one of the more common ways that you'd start in security, which was in the compliance world. So I started at PricewaterhouseCoopers, one of the big four consultancies that had a security organization that would do work in support of audit for financial controls. And so my starting point, I joined with this hope that I'd get to do hacking, but legally, like penetration testing and red teaming. And in practice, I started out actually doing a lot of really sort of mundane work for audits, which is taking like giant spreadsheets and of security controls and walking through them and checking boxes and assessing whether systems that they sampled are configured properly. Mm-hmm. I didn't love that at the time. It wasn't quite like what I dreamed, but it taught me a lot, and I'll reflect on this a bit more later. And it kind of gave me an appreciation for the many, many different domains in security and the many facets that I think one needs to be learned to be well-rounded in this industry. And I eventually then moved into doing some of the work that I initially wanted to do in penetration testing, application security. And that eventually led me down the path where I next went to Mandiant and spent 5 years doing incident response. Then to Tanium, where I helped build products to do some of the work that I formerly was doing as a consultant. And then most recently here at Facebook, where I do security engineering work, again, primarily in the security and detection and response space.
Oh, great. Thank you. I think it was very interesting to hear all your story and background and how you got into the Infosec. So it's also interesting to reflect that some professions that were illegal maybe in 90s now are legal, and people are encouraging, to go and test their systems for, penetration testing, etc. So what would you suggest to a new person who is actually who wants to get into Infosec path and build its career in there? What needs to be done there, and is it actually cool to be in infosec in general, or
Yeah,
yeah.
I think it's an amazing industry to be in, and I think reflecting on how much it's changed in the last 20 years, it's just so broad, and there's so many subdomains in security. Like it's impossible to be an expert in all of them. And I think the key is to pick a couple of areas where you want to start your journey that like you naturally gravitate to, and then try to build some depth in those areas. Like it's impossible to try to be an expert in every sub practice within
Yeah.
security. But the other thing I'd say is to actually also try to add some diversity to your work, or the things that you do when you're at home and you're tinkering in your home lab outside of security. I think that one of the things I see with a lot of security practitioners who have been in industry a lot is if you haven't had an opportunity to spend some time in like a software engineering role, in a system administration or site resiliency, operations, reliability engineering type of role, that's really valuable perspective to get. Like building and maintaining systems, dealing with situations where security is one of many competing priorities, like when you have to keep systems stable and performant and available. And I think that getting some of that experience makes you a much more well-rounded security practitioner, because it allows you to have an understanding of what the customers you're working with or the partners in your own company you're going to work with who are not security experts are going to be dealing with. And security is always a competing priority that has to be balanced with many other things. And having that sort of breadth of experience can make you that much more effective about thinking about problems more holistically and communicating well with non-security practitioners, which you're going to inevitably find you have to do in your career.
Okay. That's interesting. And I hope a lot of people here in Armenia can hear that and consider choosing this specialization as a career path, because it's very important for Armenia and for our initiative also, which I'll talk about later. So thank you, Ryan. And another question comes here. Well, there are some professionals here, but another important thing is, the products in that area, where we also need all these professionals to develop interesting products. So startup scene in cybersecurity, I think is quite sophisticated. Also in Armenia, we have quite developed scene, but this vertical is still emerging. And would it be great to share also your experience related to Tanium, because you mentioned that you helped also develop the product, and what would be your advice for someone who wants to do some interesting product solution and develop kind of solve a pain point for this industry, how they should start getting into the year, also coming from your experience?
Sure. And I'll provide I guess the disclaimer that I'm not like one of those serial entrepreneurs or venture experts.
Better.
Like I've worked at a few startups. Like when I joined Mandiant, which eventually was bought by FireEye, it was like a 60-person company. I joined Tanium at what would be, I guess, classified as an early stage startup. There was like 200 people at the time I joined, so it was still fairly large. But the experience, I got a few experiences out of those. And I guess the only other caveat I'll provide is my experience in security is very biased towards enterprise rather than consumer facing. So a few things that I've seen that's important. One is right now, the market, the security startup market is very crowded in a few areas that are, I think, glamorous areas of security, but probably not the ones that I would, if I were to start a startup, rush into. I would say like malware detection and prevention is a great example of that, where it is a market that has been just completely exhausted with startups, and it would be very hard to differentiate yourself. So I think, always starting to find that product market fit is key to any business. And in security, if you want to start local, thinking about who your customers are, what problems do you want to solve for them, and how are they approaching those problems right now is really fundamental. I think what makes this particularly unique in this current point in time in security, though, is the power that the platform owners have. And what I mean by that is we're at a point where the computing platform providers have more mature offerings and a more vested stake in security than ever. So if you look at what Microsoft has done with security in the last decade and how they've matured their product lines and their solutions, or how much AWS or Amazon spends on security related products for AWS, what that means for them, it became a competitive advantage because it attracts people to their ecosystem. For startups, it means you're competing with them, or that you may risk that you build a product that becomes popular enough that someone like Amazon turns around and turns into a feature built into their cloud platform with 80% of the functionality of your product, but a lower price and a lower barrier of entry.
Yeah.
Competing with that is, it's really scary to compete with that. So I think the things you can do to sort of buffer against that is find niches that are valuable to your customers, to your target market, but aren't a priority for the platform players to focus or execute well on yet. That's one approach. Another is to find bridges, find areas that are solving emerging problems that span multiple technologies that one provider is not solving on their own right now. And I think if you look at a lot of organizations, at least here in the US, like the number of software as a service providers that they use for different facets of IT, productivity, security, has grown from like 2, 3, 4 to like 50, 60, 100, 200. And so just thinking about how you can do the job of a couple of those solutions in the security or IT space, or remove an entire class of problems altogether, is really attractive for most businesses, because I think they're finding like, wow, these monthly subscription fees are really starting to add up. And so that's one of the many ways I think you can start to find and prove value in the security space, but really the same principles I think are true for any technology startup.
Great, and then comes my next question related to that. Do you think any, standard startup acceleration and incubation programs can be helpful for these teams and get into this path?
Yeah, absolutely. What I've seen is most effective is just the relationship building. I think when you're new and you have an idea, like a seed of a concept, pressure testing that idea by talking to potential customers and really getting the opportunity to listen deeply to their problems is one of the most valuable things that an accelerator can provide, bridging and making those relationships, providing people with who have the experience. I think one of the hard parts when you've got a great idea as a technologist is you fall in love with a solution. And especially when you're newer in a field or a career and you're trying to build a startup, falling in love with your solution plus not having like that strong network of contacts can make it very easy to sort of like keep yourself locked in a garage building a thing that may actually drift away from what people actually want or will buy. I think a good accelerator can help like find the core elements that are like sticking and help you focus on those. And as you grow and pivot and shift your business, like align it really well and get that like magical product market fit with the people who are actually going to buy and use and guide you in the next stages of your product or your company.
Oh, okay, great. We actually, announced our cybersecurity accelerator program, and thank you for being also one of our mentors. I just wanted to make sure that everybody knows that we have it here in case they want to, tap into that market. We are here to help. So thank you very much for the insights.
And thank you. I'm honored to be able to be a part of it.
Yeah, thanks. And another question is about the empathy in security. There are a lot of talks about this. Can you elaborate? What does it mean to be empathetic in the security market and in that area?
Yeah, I think, security as an industry is sort of intrinsically an adversarial and competitive field. Like we are trying to either detect bad stuff from happening or prove how bad things can happen and demonstrate that. And because of that intrinsically adversarial work, I think it is in some ways infused a lot of negativity into the security culture. And I think that seeps into the way that a lot of practitioners work with each other and interact with their colleagues, both within and outside the field. And I think a few ways I see this manifested, like when a company gets breached and the headlines talk about them getting breached because they failed to patch a bunch of systems, it's easy to victim blame and say, well, like they were negligent, they were incompetent, so of course they got compromised, and they, you know, shame on them. Similarly, like when a user gets phished or a user falls victim to some sort of scam, it's easy to blame a victim for not having good enough security awareness training. And I think empathy for security means understanding the challenges that non-security practitioners or that organizations as these massive entities have in doing security well, and making it easy to remove, or the most important thing people in security can do is make it easy to, by removing unsafe choices altogether, or making environments and structures so that isolated failures don't lead to systemic failures. And one of the many ways that we can do that is by helping organizations burn down tech debt. One of the many reasons organizations struggle with security is because when you build systems over years and years, you accumulate a lot of technical debt that then makes it hard to have a surface that can be protected. And so I think that by thinking about making the secure choice, the natural and easy choice, security teams can be enablers rather than adversaries. I'll mention one other thing that I think is an interesting read. So Usenix 2020, which was in August, there were a lot of great research studies, and one that got published was titled a Quality Evaluation of Security and Privacy Advice on the Web. And this study looked at the problem from taking thousands of articles that were providing security guidelines and doing some like metadata analysis and content analysis to look at what advice was being provided, how much of it was actionable, and how could that help or hinder non-practitioners from learning and doing the right thing. And one of the interesting findings was across the hundreds and hundreds of studied behaviors that were recommended, the top 5, there were 118 permutations of top 5 things that people should care about. And so imagine being on the receiving end of that, like 118 versions of top 5 means that you have no idea what's actually important. And even if they're all actionable, or most of them are actionable, you don't know what to prioritize. And so I think another thing that is key when you're trying to be empathetic as a security expert is think about the challenge of prioritization and actionability, and really focus on trying to provide support and messaging that with the minimal set of things possible and with empirical proof of it will actually help. Be aware of the fact that people are being flooded with guidance and recommendations, and it's very hard to sift through that and actually know what's important.
Yeah, that's actually very important, because that's so true. A lot of people are just getting a lot of guidances, and it's very hard to understand which one to follow, which one comes after what.
Yeah.
So thank you very much. It's now really important fact, I think, topic to touch. And then I think the most favorite part we want to talk about is also about your experience working on this famous TV series, Mr. Robot, that was famous just because of that, also that it had very specific and real hacks put in the film. So what was your experience of working on that? How it came to that you guys decided to actually shot a film that had to be like that, and how is it working, making hacks so fun and entertaining that even technical and the non-technical people are really getting into that?
Yeah, so I got pulled into it by just complete coincidence. I feel very fortunate to be involved because I think there's thousands and thousands of other security experts that could have done the same with their own experience. But I had a coworker that was on a panel with Cora Donna, who was one of the writers and producers on the show, and also the person responsible for bringing a lot of the technical accuracy to the hacks. He had a prior background in security, and in addition to that was also running the ARG, the alternate reality game that I know a lot of people really loved on the show. And so in season 2, I got pulled in to help out with the tech advisor group on a couple of scenes, including at the end of season 2, there's a UPS firmware hack that I worked on. And then after that, that was really good experience and it worked out well. And so they said, would you like to be more involved in season 3?
Mm-hmm.
And I was thrilled too. So for season 3, remotely, I joined the process from the beginning of the writer room sessions. And so the cool opportunity there was to think about the story that they wanted to tell and figure out how hacking and technology could support the story. And that led to planning out all of the hacks and all of the scenes for the season. And then when production started, actually going to work of creating those designs and then capturing them in a way that could be reproduced in the show. And, I think why did we do all of this work, or why was it so important? Core put it, I think, best that at the end of the day, the goal is to further the story. And if the technology that's shown and the hacks that are shown are realistic, I think it imbues a quality where people who are aware and understand technology can appreciate the show at a completely different level. And at the same time, if it's done well, and if the story is done well, the stakes are clear, the momentum of a scene is clear, and it's exciting and appealing, regardless of whether you understand the hacks or not. And so we tried to balance both and make it give people things that if they paused and screenshotted and looked at exactly what I was doing, they'd be like, oh, cool, this is legit.
Works.
Right. But if you don't know, you could still sort of follow along. And for me, one of the really exciting things there was, I would blog about a bit more detail about what went into the scenes and what we were trying to do, in part because when you work for months and months on something, and sometimes the scenes are really short. And so it's flashed on screen for a moment and then it's gone. You want to explain that. But in doing so, I would hear a lot from the security community and from people new to it who are getting into security because of the show. And that was incredibly gratifying, because it's an entertaining show, but also a way to get people interested in a industry that is in desperate need of more people and people who are excited and enthusiastic to work in it.
Yeah, actually, I must admit that it actually motivated me a lot to get into this market.
Oh, very
to
cool.
try to do something here, because that really was one of the triggers for me. And I was
going to say, it was amazing to me to see how the show resonated around the world. And so I get people reaching out from all over the world with interested in hacking, interested in the show. So yeah, it was a very rewarding and experience that I feel fortunate to have been able to have. I don't know if a show or a film will ever capture hacking quite as accurately as that one will, but perhaps as a retirement job, I'd love to do that type of thing again one day.
Yeah, actually, and one thing I was wanted to say is that what I liked a lot also in the show, that usually hackers are portrayed in a very negative way with all these illegal things, and what I liked, that it really showed what a real hacker is in the Mr. Robot, and it was, I think, very also important to have that.
Yeah, and certainly you had that entire spectrum from hacking for good to doing really destructive world cataclysmic things. One of the things that was always amazing is we would sometimes the show would reflect reality, and sometimes something would happen in real life that paralleled when the show was being aired, and we didn't even account for that. So it's just really amazing how even though real world hacks inspired a lot of what we did in the show, there have been a few cases where we've just seen things that were ended up in the show that then ended up in happening in similar fashion in real life. And it's we're at a point where the real life hacks that we see are what I would have thought of as almost science fiction 10 or 15 years ago. Competing with reality is difficult, but yeah, it's been interesting to see how the two things reflect one another.
Yeah.
I'll mention one other quick example that I always like. So there's the very grounded hacks that were real world, and then some of the interesting challenges were there were ideas in the writer's room that were a little more challenging to portray because they were a little more they were a little more out there, and refining those into things that were realistic but still fit the story was hard. And in season 3, there's a scene in the first or second episode where there's a car chase, and the original intent was like, can we have someone hack the car that's tailing them and remotely stop it? And like, while there have been in isolation a handful of like examples of car hacks, there's really nothing where like if you're sitting in a car on the fly, you can just like target any arbitrary car following you and just stop its engine. So I was like, when we were brainstorming, like, how are we going to make this possible, like without it being completely unrealistic? And so what we ended up doing, like, I came up with this idea to like go with this OnStar hack where OnStar is on a lot of vehicles, and there is an emergency service which can remotely disable the engine for a safe stop if law enforcement or emergency services need it. So ended up looking up the emergency services playbooks and manuals, which you can find online, that describe how someone who is in a police department can like contact OnStar. And then turned it into a social engineering thing, where, and you see in the actual scene, that's what happens. They social engineer OnStar. So yeah, we had to get creative, but that was like part of the hacks in creating the show, and a lot of fun.
Yeah, it was really amazing, everything. So thank you very much, Ryan. I think we are ready to open for questions, see how many questions we have. So we have a few questions here. I think we can go over. Assuming that you have done some non-legal hacking back in the days, do you miss those times? And was it romantic as was in the Hackers movie?
Yeah, I mean, nothing terribly exciting. I definitely read and learned more than like actually push the limits, just because I was like a fairly conservative and paranoid kid, so I didn't want to get myself in too much trouble. Like I had mentioned, like in my early days of learning about hacking and phone phreaking and like, you know, reading 2600, like I learned about like the way the phone system worked, and it was right when this was all changing, but like I learned how to build a red box and how that worked. And like, I remember like trying it for the first time just to see like, could I actually make the quarter tone work, and being excited and freaked out that it actually worked. Like now I'm going way, way back. So some of you may have to go Google like, what is a red box, and learn about the golden days of phone phreaking. But like, that was pretty cool. Like I never soldered anything before. I never dabbled in electronics. And so it was like really, really interesting. I guess the only other thing is like, I remember having a dial-up modem, and when I would read and learn about bulletin board systems and like learn like all the like hacking and security information was disseminated in text files back then. And I remember learning about war dialing, and so like silly me, without understanding how like phone charges work, like set up my modem to like war dial ranges, and ended up like racking up a pretty large long distance phone bill from like finding and then being connected to like a bulletin board system or some device that was like across the country, if not across the world, for 20 or 30 minutes. And so I remember my parents being like, what are these phone charges and what are you doing? So I quickly learned to be careful there. But yeah, I guess that's about as closest to the edge I got. As I said, once I got to finally get to the point in my career where I could do penetration testing, that was just a thrill, because it was like, okay, cool. I can now, within the bounds of like not breaking anything or harming the company, of course, like hack, but legally. And that was super exciting, and a nice way to like channel that energy into something safe and productive.
Okay, good. I hope we answered your question. There is another question. Did you have friends who got in trouble due to hacking? And if so, what's their story? Or you yourself, did you get into, into
I don't
trouble?
think I ever got in trouble aside from that like tiny little story.
Yeah.
No, I will say like, not for hacking, but like back in the day when I would do penetration testing, we had, so we were doing penetration testing, so we were authorized to do it. But I had colleagues and myself too, where we would make mistakes sometimes and end up disrupting systems or bringing systems down without intending to. And that was always a little bit scary, because if you're like doing penetration testing for a big company and you accidentally like suddenly get that system not available message, and it's an important system, like even if it's within the rules of engagement, you kind of get that terror feeling that you broke something you shouldn't have. So you know, that type of thing happens. And I think the one interesting thing to reflect on is like, security and even work like penetration testing is much more regimented in some ways now than it was like 15 or 20 years ago. And I think about like how sloppy I was doing penetration testing. Like there was no thought towards OPSEC. So like cleaning up artifacts after yourself and like thinking about resulting evidence you're leaving behind, like, yeah, just not nearly as like disciplined about it as people tend to be now, whether you're hacking for real or even just doing like legitimate penetration testing. So I think like things have matured a lot. And if you're in the offensive security space, I think people have a lot more awareness of like the impact that their actions can have and the evidence trail that it can leave behind. And I think that's created a very interesting cat and mouse game dynamic between people who are passionate about offensive security and people who are passionate about defense. So I've diverged really far from the original question, but
that's okay.
But yeah.
I think it's still interesting. Yeah, we have another question. Has the industrialization of Infosec affected technical interests in innovation compared to the 90s and 2000s?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I think there are pluses and minuses to it. I was lucky enough to like get to go to DEF CON when I was 18. So it was like 1999 and like early stages of that, not the early stage of that scene, but like before the mass commercialization of like massive security conferences. And to be clear, DEF CON has remained, kept that its authenticity and is, you know, credit to Jeff and all involved in doing that. But like you go to Vegas during conference week now and like DEF CON's still going, which is awesome. But then you've got like events where you've got thousands and thousands of salespeople and booths that cost $100,000 plus, and it's kind of a zoo. And I compare that back to the scene in the 90s where there was like a level of authenticity and genuineness that hadn't been spoiled by commercial interests, and it's kind of disappointing. But I'll say this, like, I don't think it's as like overdeveloped as the industry is, and as much like downside has come from the fact that it's so commercialized and there's so much money in it that like a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt drives business. I think it's also provided so much opportunity. Like I think it's, there are so many domains in security. There are so many tools out there to help you get involved in security, from CTFs to the fact that like in a couple of clicks, I can spin up environments to replicate pretty much any type of infrastructure I want and test and learn from it. All of that didn't exist like 10, 15, 20 years ago. And so for all the downsides that I think the hyper industrialization of security has brought, like I think there are some areas in which like the barriers to entry for people are like that want to learn and dabble are much lower. And I think that's a great thing. Going back to my sort of soapbox before about empathy, I think like continuing to just try to build a community where people are supportive, where people are trying to get people that are underrepresented in security to feel welcome and involved, I think can help restore some of that culture from like that halcyon days of the 90s that was more about learning and exploration and less about sort of that adversarial aspect or on like trying to rack up and make some money.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's really interesting. And while talking about CTFs, I just wanted to mention that next weekend we actually are conducting our first international CTF online.
Oh, awesome.
Purely, so yeah, feel
cool.
free. Yeah, so also for everyone, feel free to join. The registration is open and we hope it will be fun. Great. So let's see what questions you have. What would you recommend to a team of developers to do to ensure security of their software?
Oh, that's also a great question.
Yeah.
So I think one of the keys is for security practitioners to try to help developers build safe, secure software by default, rather than coming in with an assessment or a penetration test once something's deployed after the fact. So I would say both for developers and for the security teams they're working with to like build those relationships early, and especially from the security developer side or security side, like learn. This goes to what I said earlier, that it's really beneficial if people with a passion for security spend some time in software development, I think it gives you an appreciation for like the challenges that engineers face, and the fact that like if you can make it easy for them to build things securely in the first place and close off entire like categories of vulnerabilities or attacks, it makes software developers more productive, and it makes things more secure. We don't keep following these sort of cycles of coming in to add security after the fact. I think, you know, the approach a long time, like a decade or two ago, is like to try to do this with education. I think back to the early days of web application security where like when SQL injection was first a thing, and everyone was trying to teach and educate and guide developers to not build code that was vulnerable to SQL injection. What ultimately ended up helping the most was building the underlying development framework so that when you interact with the database, you can't leave a SQL injection vulnerability if you use the APIs and libraries correctly. Now, that isn't to say the problem is eradicated, but it's significantly smaller because security engineers and software developers alike worked on the core frameworks to make the default the secure way of doing things. In this case, like, how do I connect to a database? How do I interact with a database? How do I get data out of it? That's the sort of pattern we need everywhere in security, to get in early and fix the underlying platforms, so that when someone builds something new, like security just comes for free because that's how it was designed.
Ah, okay. Yeah, I think that's very important, like privacy by design, security by design, all those kind of issues that
Totally.
needs to be considered. And I think our community will take that into consideration. Next question, what are the types of new threats that you are most concerned about?
It's an interesting question. Like, in some ways, I feel that the way targeted threat actors operate today has not changed significantly from a decade ago, in terms of the specific exploits change, the specific, some of the specific tooling changes, but the essential pattern of like compromise an individual, get a foothold in their environment, and then pivot from that foothold to escalate privileges and propagate, hasn't really changed all that much. I think that maybe not a specific threat actor, but I think there's a few different threat surfaces that companies have to deal with that didn't necessarily pose as big of a risk a decade ago. I think one comes from just managing access and managing the sort of proliferation of sensitive data across all the services that most businesses use. If you think of the average company that's using a collaboration platform like Slack, a productivity platform like G Suite or Office 365, a finance platform, a customer management platform, a marketing platform, like you add up all those services, like the underlying problem of managing who has access, how much access do they have, how is the data going in and out of those systems, how is it protected images, is extremely hard. And from a threat actor's perspective, it's leaving soft spots where even if companies start to do a really good job of hardening endpoints and making it harder and harder to like gain a foothold on a Windows or Mac system, those soft spots mean that like it may be very easy to get a foothold in one of those services and then leverage that foothold to propagate access to other applications and systems. As more companies go to work from home, we're seeing a lot of shift too in like how remote access to critical systems, both on premises and remote, is entitled and managed. And all of that boils down to like, how do those systems trust the user or trust the source system? You know, gone are the days where like the VPN is the security boundary between the inside and the outside world. And so like without that choke point, there are some really difficult things that you have to do to make sure that like you're only allowing trusted access to key resources. It's hard to get that right with small environments. It's incredibly hard to get it right when you've got lots and lots of users and lots of services and systems. And so I think that that's one of like the fundamental problems that companies are dealing with now. And I think work from home is exacerbating it because in order to keep the business running, people have to like think about remote first. And thinking about remote first often means challenging assumptions about trust in the user or the device that you might have made when they were on premises entity.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Ryan. Another interesting question. When you bump in a person who doesn't understand what's called with cybersecurity and is pretty careless, thinking even passwords on phone PCs are not something she needs to care about, how would you explain to him and change mind of them? What stories or arguments would you use?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Like, I feel like that's less of a challenge now than it was maybe a decade ago, only just because like every single day the news has a story about a security or privacy incident leading to exposure. And I think at least 2/3 of my friends have either had their credit card numbers stolen and fraudulent charges racked up or some other disruptive event. Um, but I think what I would say is like, if we accept that like people don't want their private data or their financial data stolen and people are generally concerned about that, I think the key is to just provide like a very small set of actionable things that actually have an effect. And so the ones that I always go back to are like a handful of very simple recommendations. Use a password manager. I will always help people like set up and use a password manager. Try to do more of most of your, if you're not like in an engineering role, try to do most of your computing on platforms that are more secure by design. So I think Chrome OS, iOS, and even Android are far more locked down than your typical Windows or Mac system. Of those, Chrome OS and iOS especially, just because of their walled garden design. There are trade-offs in that walled garden design, but I think from an average user perspective, the walled garden affords a layer of security that's really valuable. So using a secure, simple platform like that where you can, and using a password manager, I think are like the two things that reduce a lot of risk. I think where people sometimes get confused with security guidance or where some security guidance is misleading, I think like one that gets sometimes overused is like use a VPN and avoid insecure Wi-Fi. So like, yes, there are situations where like using a VPN is the right thing. And yes, there are situations where like being on an open Wi-Fi is dangerous, but like, if you think about how most systems and websites and applications work, like everything's over TLS. Like I can be on open Wi-Fi. It's still generally going to be safe for the average user to be able to interact with their websites over TLS encrypted sessions without having to worry about someone man in the middling them. That sort of goes to thinking about someone's threat model. And if you're like, you've got someone asking you like, hey, I just want to deal with like protecting myself against the basics, what do I do? Their threat model is not protecting themselves against like the ninja hackers that are going to be like burning zero-day exploits to get at you. So I think like keep that in mind when dispensing security advice, because like as a community, and I'm guilty of this myself, like we tend to be paranoid because we know too much about all the ways you can get hacked. That sometimes leads to that just like overflow of advice, which can just overwhelm people.
Great, thank you. There's another question I think would be interesting also. What do you think about cyber wars between different countries or conflicting countries? What needs to be done, to increase any country's cyber power?
Yeah, it's a
little bit political, but I mean, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, even without getting into the political aspect of it, I think like it was an inevitability, like espionage and information warfare tactics predate the computing age and the internet age. And so it was only natural that similar tactics and similar ways that countries spy on one another, try to disrupt one another, and even sadly, at some point, perhaps go to war with another would shift into the like cyber landscape. Like it was just inevitable. I think that like one of the key things for me is that I've learned is like, technology is not the sole solution to all of this. It's a key part of it, but like a lot of it does come down to policy making. A lot of it does come down to the same sort of like relationship management that governs all sorts of international conflict. And so like technology is only a very, very small part of this. And I think we're seeing countries try to test and evolve different approaches to counteract it. Like when you see a country like the US indict individuals, like the big yesterday or the day before, there was a big indictment of APT-41 actors in China. Indictments like that are meant to put pressure and to not only demonstrate that we're completely able to investigate and be aware of what these actors are doing, but we're willing to out them, we're willing to out their methodologies, we're willing to expose what they're doing. And that creates political pressure that then gets folded into lots of other conflict and lots of other non-security related areas of international relationships. And so I think, yeah, that will continue to play out. I think the cyber landscape is just one of the many battlefields and means of engagement that you'll see in conflicts in the future.
Yeah, great. Thank you. How is your with time, Ryan? Let me know because I have 2 more questions.
Maybe we can do 1 more question.
1 more, great. Okay, short one. If not VPN for secure remote access, would you recommend? What would you recommend for small medium businesses in 2020?
So I think as companies sort of shift to the zero trust model, the notion is that instead of having a network choke point to authenticate access to remote resources, you determine if the device that you're connecting to that resource from is trustworthy. And I think, there's a lot of different approaches to how you do that authentication and authorization, leveraging multi-factor, using technologies like WebAuthn that are resilient to some of the attacks that we've seen against less secure means of 2-factor, are great authentication approaches to allow people to access resources and ensure that the person accessing the resource is really the person that should be. Device attestation is an interesting space too, making sure that if you're a company and you've got a company laptop and it's accessing a site without going through VPN, how do you trust that laptop is in a good state? There's a lot of products and technologies that do things like assess the health of the device, make sure it's compliant, make sure it's configured and locked down appropriately, and that it has all the authentication credentials needed to validate, yes, this is actually a trusted device. It's not just some random computer on the internet that where the operator has a password. So I think the hardest part about that sort of zero trust model where you don't have a network choke point begins with the asset inventory problem of tracking what assets you have, what users you have, what credential mechanisms they have, and how do you securely entitle that access. The Beyond Corp architecture docs, and now it's actually being productized, are a great starting point reference for that. But I think that for me, one of the most exciting enablers of that is secure authentication technologies. I mentioned WebAuthn a moment ago. The fact that more and more computing devices have a hardware backed element that you can use for secure authentication and secure attestation is really valuable. Adding that hardware based element to that security model starts to whittle away at some of the risks that would otherwise be present where credentials could be stolen and reused from untrusted devices. And so that trajectory is an exciting one. And for remote work, it's also great because VPN is one of many points of friction in remote work. And so if you can build systems that don't depend on that as a security layer, then you make it easier for people to do their jobs too.
Okay. Great. Thank you very much, Ryan. It was a great pleasure. I'm sure all our participants really enjoyed all your insights and the conversation. Thoughts about the cybersecurity, the education, the career path, and everything. And you are still with us. I'm sure we'll still have a lot of more chances to do this kind of webinars and presentations. And we definitely look forward to see you and welcome you here in Armenia one day during one of our events. So
thank you so much. Yeah, I hope to do this again and hope to have an opportunity to come out there when this pandemic settles down. So thank you to all for joining. And again, really appreciate this opportunity. Hope everyone stays well.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye, Ryan. Շնորհակալություն բոլորին, նաև ուզում եմ ասեմ մեր ինիշիատիվի մասին երկու բառ, CyHub Armenia-ի մասին, անպայման ուզում հետևեք մեր Facebook-ի էջին, մեր բոլոր սոցիալական ցանցերին, որովհետև տենց հետաքրքիր միջոցառումներ շատ են կանելու, տարբեր ծրագրեր ունենք, ու ինձ թվում է community-ին շատ հետաքրքիր կլինի։ Hence for stay tuned ու շնորհակալություն այսօր մեզ միանալու համար։ Իսկ CyHub initiative-ը դա հերթական մեր նախագծերից է, որ իրականացնում է ձեռնարկությունների ինկուբատոր հիմնադրամը մեր տարբեր գործընկերների հետ համատեղ համաշխարհային բանկի, Հայաստանի Հանրապետության բարձր տեխնոլոգիաների նախարարության, Հայաստանի Հանրապետության կառավարության, IBM-ի, Cisco-ի, մեր պոլիտեխնիկի համալսարանի եւ Մերգելյանի ինստիտուտի հետ համատեղ։ Hence for ինչպես կասեմ, stay tuned եւ շնորհակալություն։ Լավ մնացեք։